The African Child, Chapter 4. December always found me at Tindikan. December is our dry season, when we have fine weather and harvest our rice. Year after year, I was invited to this great harvest, which is always the occasion of great junketings and feastings. And I used to wait impatiently for my uncle to come and fetch me. Of course, the festival had no set date, since it depended on the ripening of the rice. And this, in turn, depended on the weather, the goodwill of the heavens. It depended, perhaps, still more on the goodwill of the spirits of the soil, whose influence could not be ignored. If their response was favorable, it only remained to beg of them, on the day before the harvest, to provide sunny skies and protection for the harvesters against the danger of snake bites. When the great day had arrived, the head of each family would rise at dawn to go and cut the first swath in his fields. As soon as this first sheaf had been cut, the tom-tom would sound, signaling the beginning of the harvest. Such is our custom. I could not have said then why this was done, why the signal was given only after the first swath had been cut in each of the fields. I only know that such was the custom, and that was enough for me. Like all our customs, this one must have had its own significance, which I could have easily found out from the elders of the village, who kept its secret meaning in the ancestral depths of heart and memory. But at that time, I was not old enough or curious enough to ask my elders and betters, and when finally I wanted to do so, I had left Africa behind. Today, I am inclined to think that these first swaths were cut in order to break the spell of inviolability which one feels at the sight of an unmown field. But I do not remember that these first swaths served any particular purpose once they had been cut. I do not remember them being used as offerings. Sometimes only the spirit of a tradition survives, and so it happens that the merest ghost of an outward ceremony remains. Was that the case here? I cannot say. Though I made frequent visits to Tindikan, they did not last long enough for me to find out everything. All I know is that the tom-tom used to sound only after the first sheaf had been gathered, and that we used to await the signal eagerly, because we were always in a hurry to go get to work, and also because we wanted to leave the rather chilly shadow of the great trees at the edge of the fields, where the morning air used to be piercingly cold. When the signal had been given, the reapers used to set out, and I would fall into step with them, marching to the rhythm of the tom-tom. The young men used to toss their glittering sickles high in the air and catch them as they fell, shouting aloud for the simple pleasure of hearing their own strong voices, and sketching a dance step or two on the heels of the tom-tom players. I suppose I should have done well to follow my grandmother's advice and to keep at a safe distance from those lively jugglers. But there was such a vivid freshness in the morning air, such scintillating vivacity in their juggling feats, in the spinning sickles that in the rising sun would blaze and flash with sudden brilliance. And there was such irresistible alacrity in the rhythm of the tom-tom that I could never have kept myself away from them. Besides, at that particular season, it was impossible not to want to join in everything. In our December, the whole world is in flower and the air is sweet. Everything is young and fresh. The season seems linked with the summer, and the countryside that for so long has been drenched in rain and shrouded in baleful mists now lies radiant. The sky has never seemed so blue, so brilliant. The birds are ecstatically singing. There is joy all round us. Its gentle explosions are echoed in every heart. It was this season, this beautiful time of the year, that was stirring me so deeply. And the beat of the tom-tom and the festive air of our little procession moved me also. It was the best time of the year, the summer and all it stands for, all it holds and cannot hold. For how could it contain so much profusion? And it made my heart leap with joy. When they had arrived at the first harvest field, the men would line up at the edge, naked to the loins, their sickles at the ready. Then my uncle Lasana or some other farmer, for the harvest threw people together, and everyone lent a hand in each other's harvesting, would invite them to begin work. At once, the black torsos would bend over the great golden field, and the sickles would begin the reaping. Now it was not only the breeze of morning that was making the whole field sway and shiver, but the men also, with their sickles. These sickles kept rising and falling with astonishing rapidity and regularity. They had to cut the stalks between the bottom joint and the lowest leaf, so that only the leaf was left behind. Well, they hardly ever missed. Of course, such a degree of accuracy depended on the reaper. He would hold the ear with one hand and incline the stalk to receive a clean blow from the sickle. He would reap the ears one by one, but the swift rise and fall of the sickle was nevertheless amazing. Besides, each man made it a point of honor to reap as accurately and as swiftly as possible. He would move forward across the field with a bunch of stalks in his hand, and his fellow workmen would judge his skill by the number and the size of his sheaves. My young uncle was wonderfully skillful at rice cutting. In fact, there was no one to touch him at it. I would follow proudly behind him, ready to take each sheaf as he cut it. When I had taken a sheaf from him, I would strip the stalks of their leaves, then trim them all to an equal length, and pile them up. And I would always take care to do this very gently, for rice is harvested only when it is very ripe. And if it is roughly handled, the ears would lose the best part of their grains. I did not tie the sheaves, for that was a man's job. But once they had been tied, I was allowed to go and put them on the great pile in the center of the field. As the morning drew on, it would become hotter, the air seeming to quiver in a dense heat haze, which was intensified by clouds of dust from the trampled soil and stubble. This was the moment when my uncle would wipe the sweat from his forehead and his chest and ask for his water bottle. I would run and fetch it from under the leaves where it lay, fresh and cool, and offer it to him with the words, "Will you leave some for me?" You don't think I would drink it all, do you? But I would watch anxiously as, holding the flask high in the air, he quaffed great draughts of the water without touching the flask to his lips. "There, that's better," he would say, handing the bottle to me. "The dust cakes in your throat." I would put my lips to the bottle, and at once the coolness of the water would make itself felt throughout my whole body, with a kind of fresh interior radiance. But its refreshment was only momentary. It was soon forgotten and left my body bathed in sweat. "Take your shirt off," my uncle would say. "It's soaking wet. You shouldn't keep wet things on your chest." And he would start work again. And I would start following him again, proud to see that we were the leaders. "Aren't you tired?" I would ask him. "Why should I be tired?" "Your sickle moves so quickly." "It does, doesn't it?" "We are ahead of all the others." "Oh, are we?" "You know we are," I would cry. "Why do you say, 'Oh, are we?' like that?" I don't want to boast, you know. No, of course not. And I would begin to wonder if I should ever be able to do what he was doing one day, and to do it as well as he did. "Won't you let me reap for a while?" What would your grandmother say? A sickle is not a plaything. You have no idea how sharp it is. Yes, I do. Now, it isn't your job to cut rice. I shouldn't think it ever will be later on. But I didn't like to be so easily put off from working in the fields. Later. Why only later? I did not see why I should not become a reaper like the rest of them. A farmer too. Was it because? "Well, are you daydreaming?" my uncle would say. And I would take the bundle of stalks he handed me, strip off the leaves, and trim the stalks. Yes, I had been daydreaming. My life did not lie here, nor in my father's forge either. Then what sort of life was I going to lead? And I would tremble at the thought of the unknown existence ahead of me. Wouldn't it have been simpler to follow in my father's footsteps? School, school, I would say to myself. Did I like school all that much? Maybe I did. My uncles, yes, my uncles had followed quite naturally in their father's footsteps, though others had taken a different course. My father's brothers had gone to Conakry. My uncle Lasana's twin brother was, but where was he now? Well, stay daydreaming? My uncle would ask. Yes, no, If you go on like this, we will lose the lead. I was thinking about Uncle Bo. Where is he now? God only knows. On his last visit, he was, you see, I don't know where he is anymore. He's never in the same place. He's like a bird. He can't stay quietly on one tree. He needs the whole sky. Will I too be like a bird someday? What are you talking about? Well, you've just told me that Uncle Bo is like a bird. Do you want to become like him? I don't know yet. Well, you have plenty of time to make your mind up anyhow. Meanwhile, take this sheaf. And he would go on reaping. Even though his body was soaking wet, he always returned to his work with great vigor, as if he were only just beginning. But all the same, the heat was a burden. The air would seem to weigh down upon us, and weariness would gradually begin to creep over us. Draughts of cold water were no longer any good, and so we would begin to fight our weariness with singing. Sing with us, my uncle would say. The tom-tom, which had been following us as we advanced into the field, kept time with our singing. We sang like a choir, often very high, with great bursts of melody, and sometimes very low, so low that we could hardly be heard, and our weariness would disappear, the heat grow less. If on such occasions I paused for a moment and gazed at the reapers, the long sinuous line of reapers, I would always be struck, delightfully touched, enraptured in fact, by the tenderness, the vast infinite tenderness in their eyes, by the immense serenity of their gaze. And that does not mean it was not remote or preoccupied, as they looked about them from time to time. And yet, although they all seemed to me at such moments miles away from what they were doing, though their eyes seemed far away from what they were doing, their skill never faltered. The dark hands and the glittering sickles kept moving with an unbroken, almost abstracted precision. What was it those eyes were actually gazing at? I do not know. The surrounding countryside? Maybe. Maybe it was the distant trees and the far-off sky. Maybe not. Maybe those eyes were gazing at nothing, fixed on the invisible. And maybe that is what made them appear so tranced, so abstracted. The long wavering line of reapers kept on moving deeper and deeper into the field, laying it bare. Wasn't that enough? Wasn't it enough to see the ears of rice bowing before the long, gentle wave of those black bodies? Our husbandmen were singing, and as they sang, they reaped. They were singing in chorus and reaping in unison. Their voices and their gestures were all harmonious, and in harmony they were one, united by the same task, united by the same song. They were bound to one another, united by the same soul. Each and every one was tasting the delight, savoring the common pleasure of accomplishing a common task. Was it this delight, this pleasure, even more than the fight against weariness and against the burden of the heat, that urged them on, that filled them to overflowing with rapturous song? Such was obviously the case. And this is what filled their eyes with so much tenderness, that wonderful serenity that used to strike me with such delighted and rather regretful astonishment. For though I was among them, with them, surrounded by these waves of tenderness, I was not one of them. I was only a schoolboy on a visit, and how I longed to forget that fact. Actually, I often did forget it. I was still very young and was often able to forget myself in the moment, everything that passed through my head. And that was a great deal, was almost always fleeting and less enduring than the clouds that moved across the summer sky. And besides, I was at that age. I shall never grow out of it. When one lives entirely in the present, and in those days, holding the first position in the long line of reapers seemed to have more importance than anything I would be likely to do in the future. Make haste, I would urge my uncle. Oh, so you've woken up at last, he would tease me. Yes, we mustn't waste any more time. Who's been wasting time? Me? No, but you might if we go on like this. We're not so far ahead now. Oh? And he will take a look round the field. Is that what you call not being so far ahead? Well, I'm pretty sure I've not been wasting my time, but maybe I ought to now. Don't forget, I mustn't get too far ahead of the others. It would not be polite. I do not know how the idea of rustic manners, I use the word in its accepted sense of lacking in delicacy, came to be associated with the people of the fields. The outward forms of common civility are more scrupulously observed in the country than in the town. There a certain ceremony in manners is observed, which the town has no time for. The way of life, of course, is simpler in the country, but a countryman's dealings with his fellow men follow accepted rules. Familiarity is discouraged, perhaps because country people are familiar with every detail of each other's lives. In everything, I noticed a kind of dignity which was often lacking in town life. No one ever did anything without first having been ceremoniously invited to do so, even though he had a right to do so. The personal liberty of others was, in fact, always highly respected. And if their minds seemed to work slower in the country, that was because they always spoke only after due reflection, and because speech itself was a most serious matter. At midday, the women, bearing steaming platters of couscous, would leave the huts and walk in single file to the field. As soon as we caught sight of them, we would shout our greetings. Midday! It was midday, and work would stop all over the field. Come on, my uncle would say, and I would run along behind him. Not so fast, I would say. I can't keep up with you. Is there a hole in your stomach? He would ask me. I could stable an ox in mine. I'm so hungry. And our appetites were in fact wonderfully whetted. However strong the sun, however furnace hot the field with its dust and its quivering haze, it did not interfere with our appetites. We would squat down round the platters, and the hot couscous, made even hotter by the spices in it, would disappear, engulfed in great hungry mouthfuls, washed down by bumpers of cool water drawn from huge jars covered with banana leaves. The break would last until 2 o'clock, and the men would spend the time sleeping in the shade of the trees or sharpening their sickles. Tireless, the young lads would play games or go and set snares, and though we would, as usual, make a lot of noise, we would take care not to whistle, because we were not supposed to whistle or pick up dead wood during the time of the harvest. Such things would have brought misfortune to the fields. The afternoon's work was much shorter, and the time used to fly. It would be 5 o'clock before we knew it. The great field would now be shorn of its precious yield, and we would walk back in procession to the village. The tall silk cotton trees and the wavering smoke from the huts seemed to welcome us from far off, preceded by the indefatigable tom-tom player, and singing at the tops of our voices the song of the rice. Overhead, the swallows would already be skimming lower, though the air would still be clear as ever. But they, too, knew when the end of the day was near. We would go home contented, weary but happy. The good spirits had taken care of us. Not one of us had been bitten by snakes that our trembling feet might have disturbed. The flowers, which would begin to unfold with the approach of evening, would be spreading their perfume on the air again, so that we walked as if attired in freshly plucked garlands. If we had not been singing so loudly, we might have been able to hear the familiar sounds of the close of day, the shouts and laughter of women mingling with the lowing of cattle returning to their buyers. But we were singing, always singing. Ah, how happy we were in those days.